Well, Tom, I'm happy that you're doing this program with me, and I have an idea that we've talked about how I want to do it, and I want to propose a thesis and allow you to bring your lawyer skills to bear on it. I want to accept the challenge. I want to be questioned on the thesis, and I know that you are ready for that sort of thing. My thesis has to do with the nature of theology. And one of my major points is that theology is relevant, that it makes a difference. Now, you can talk about that in one way of saying theology makes a difference in people's lives, their personal life, their spiritual growth, of how they find God in ordinary experience. And you could grill me on that particular side of it. But I want to make another kind of claim here, and that is that theology is relevant for the culture in which we live, that it has great significance for our societal living, that it's important for public policy questions of us functioning better as a nation. And I'll make my thesis in these terms, that the more scientific theology is, the better job it will do of helping us to produce a better culture and society.
Well, first, Jim, I have to tell you that I accept your challenge. And I want to remind you that on another occasion, you gave me the opportunity to question you. And I have to tell you that when I had finished questioning you on that other occasion, I received a good deal of mail and phone calls from members of the Word and Edgewise Society who criticized me for being far too lenient with you. They said, look, you're a trial lawyer. Don't let him off the hook so easily. So the challenge, sir, is accepted.
I'm glad. And the battle is now enjoined. Go ahead.
But let's be specific. One of the problems I have as a trial lawyer when experts on any subject, for example, appear in court, they're often too general. They don't bring their thesis down the ladder of abstraction to experiences and observations that we as laymen in these matters can understand. Can you give me one or two examples of how theology and its practical application today is involved in the process of forming public policy?
Okay. Let's take the example of the economy in our own country and how we would try to produce economic reform and make things go better. One of the things that theologians would draw upon are the insights of what we call the liberation theologians. Liberation theologians, often associated with Latin America, but we have them in our own country as well. And what they would do is to try to read the Scriptures, look at the Judeo-Christian tradition from the viewpoint of the poor. They would say something like this, that theology in the past has always been done from the viewpoint of the dominant class, males who are well off and who are educated and so on. And that this produces a bias in the way we read the Scriptures and in the way we do our theology. So they would say, now let's redo it. Let's look at this long tradition from the viewpoint of the oppressed, the poor, the marginalized. When they do that, they come up with important themes. Just a couple of examples. The Exodus theme in the Hebrew Scriptures. And they say, look what happened in the Exodus. In the Exodus, God gave political, social, and economic freedom to a group of slaves in Egypt who were under the thumb of the Pharaoh. He took them out from that enslaved situation, gave them a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Scriptures say, their own land, gave them a new life of freedom where they were able to be responsible for themselves. The liberation theologians look at that and they say, aha, in our tradition we see a God who has a special care for the poor, and we ought to keep that in mind. Now, I could expand the point, but I can see you're getting antsy here to ask me a question. But let me just apply it now. So we then look at the situation in the United States and to our economy, and we say we cannot have an economy that ignores these poor people. They have to have a voice, because out of our Judeo-Christian tradition, there's a God who loves those people, and they deserve justice. And therefore, we want into this mix of how we're going to improve our economy, we want a care for the unemployed, for those who are on the margins of society and those who feel powerless. So let's find a way, as we fine-tune our economy or reform it in various ways, to make sure they're in the mix. We want to give a voice to those powerless people.
Well, Jim, I can almost hear some of the listeners' minds working as you say that. First of all, we're going to try and get down and be specific here. But you can't separate, I would submit to you, economics from politics. And so when we talk about changing the economic system, we are talking about obviously working through political, among other institutions, to do that. But one of the most important institutions is the political institution. That, of course, raises the fundamental question of the relationship between religion and politics in a pluralistic society. There are those who would say, Father, unless I misunderstand you, you're saying that theologians should be sitting at the right elbow of policymakers and talking to policymakers whose training is in economics. That's very dangerous, Father. It's thinking like that brought us about Marxism. Isn't Marxism and I'm going to put it in quotes, isn't Marxism a kind of a theology, an atheistic theology? I know that's a contradiction in terms, but it's a system of thought which was meant to organize society in a more just way. And wasn't it the fact that Marxist theologians, quote unquote, were allowed to shape the thinking in many respects of those who imposed socialism on the world? Isn't that at root the cause of many of the economic injustices and the oppression that we see, for example, in communist nations?
Well, let's keep this discussion located here. Let's stay in the United States, and let's say, how are theologians going to make an impact on public policy? So I'm not saying you used your image was sitting at the right hand of the politicians.
Oh, no, I'm raising a prior question. The question is should. You see, I think your observation begs an essential question that I think you need to deal with first, and that is, should theologians be making an impact on policymakers?
Well, it makes that question, though, dovetails with how they're going to do it. I mean, you've made an assumption in your comments that they're going to dominate this debate or tell politicians what to do. Let me just clarify, first of all, what I think they ought to be doing, and then we'll see whether, and how it would look. Then we'll see if that is valuable or not.
But my question to you is, why should they be doing anything?
Because they have something valuable to contribute. They have something that we will get better public policy if the theologians are partners to the dialogue. That's what we need. So we need the theologians to be able to say what the religious traditions have to offer by way of wisdom about the public policy questions of our age, whether it has to do with feeding hungry people or controlling the nuclear threat or figuring out how to overcome our unemployment problems. We want the wisdom of that tradition to be brought to bear upon the debate. We don't want to control it, and the theologians should not want to create Christendom or a new kind of theocracy here in the United States. We must respect the rules of the game in the United States, and the theologians generally do that. We know we live in a pluralistic society. But we want a voice. We want to be partners in this whole process.
I don't think you've answered my question. The real question is the wisdom of which tradition. So you are using a value-loaded term, the wisdom of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the wisdom of the Catholic tradition, the wisdom of traditional Protestant, the traditional Protestant ethos as embodied in, say, the mainline thinking of Protestant theologians from the mainline Protestant religions. What ethos? That's the problem. Who sits down at the elbow of the policymaker? The Catholic theologian, the Protestant theologian, the rabbi?
I think that all of the representatives of the operative religious traditions in the United States ought to have a voice in the public policy discussion. Therefore, the Protestant world should be represented, the Jewish world, the Catholic world, I suppose to a growing degree, Asiatics, the Muslim world. We're not dealing with 100 different world religions. We have a limited number that can be named, and I see no reason why any of that wisdom should be excluded, nor should a country that wants to come up with wise public policy exclude anybody from the debate. As a matter of fact, all citizens have that right. Question is really the way we set it up and organize it, does that voice get heard? My contention is that there is a wisdom and power in those religious traditions that will help us. Now, I represent the Catholic tradition, and And I would want to have that voice heard. And I think there's a distinctive sort of voice that comes out of that heritage. The same with the Protestant Jewish world and so on. So it's, again, not mysterious. It's concrete representatives of a very particular tradition that ought to be heard. And I think very often we will do better in our decision-making if we do it. Let's take Vietnam. In the Pentagon Papers, one of the things that was said was that in all the decision-making things they could find, and they never found a moral voice. There was not anyone ever sitting in public policy decision-making saying, but wait a second, what about the ethical question here? Does this make sense morally? Never brought up. And I think because it was never brought up, we ended up in the terrible fiasco that we call Vietnam that we still suffer from.
All right, let's move on, and let's assume that we can't, obviously, we could argue, and you understand I'm playing the role of the devil's advocate here. I'm making you defend your thesis.
That's exactly why we brought you on this program, as a matter of fact.
And I want the listeners to understand that the fact that I'm putting Father Jim on the spot doesn't mean that I disagree with him necessarily on his thesis. Obviously, we have to get beyond the question of whether there should be any role for theologians and ethicians in shaping public policy in the realm of economics to get to the question of how we do it. Now, how as a practical matter does someone steeped in religious or in the ethical tradition, i.e. a theologian, a practicing theologian, how do you go about influencing public policy?
Well, let me make a distinction here. The theologians address at least three different worlds. They address the church, they address the academy or the university, and they address the public. And they operate in, usually a particular theologian will choose one or the other of those worlds to do their major work in. And the influence that they have will be dependent on their audience. So, for example, let's say a theologian who works mostly within church circles. Now, that theologian, is keeping with our economic point here, is going to have to show to the people that he or she addresses that there is in the Scriptures a sort of preferential option for the poor, as we call it these days, or a special love. Let's get away from the technical term because it's going to mess us up here. But that there's a care demonstrated by God for the poor and oppressed in the Scriptures, that there's a justice that we need to work for in the world, there's a responsibility we have for other people, and we got to be concerned about the common good and not just saving our own souls. Those kind of themes will be enunciated by the theologian within the church circles with the hope that these church-going people will then go out and try to make a difference in the public sphere in various ways by voting for particular candidates according to their positions, and voting intelligently, maybe by acting well in welfare agencies, all kind of ways, or just simple things by destroying the mythology that all the people on welfare are cheating the system and are driving around in Cadillacs or something, just to dispel those kinds of false notions. That's one way a theologian would do it, by working within the church context. You want to stop me there before I talk about the other publics?
Yeah, because I think that some people listening would say, well, that's very good, but in a general sense, we can agree with you. But the problem comes in the particular applications. For instance, a public policy maker, a member of Congress, is forced to make some specific choices. Do I vote, for example, for the B-2 bomber, or do I vote against it?
Right.
It's not as simple as saying I care for the poor. I dare say that Democrats, Republicans, and independents of all persuasions would agree that homelessness is a tragedy, that in America, if we're to be a truly just nation, all poor people should have a minimal standard of existence for themselves, a home, enough to eat. They shouldn't be starving. That starvation and poverty are tragedies. They'd all agree with that. The question becomes how in the real world, in a pluralistic society where you have clashing groups, you have unions, you have manufacturers, you have bankers, you have citizens organized in various groups, in a society where we only can get things done through the clash of these organizations competing within the framework of law. How do you actually use theology to influence the practical kind of choices that policymakers have to make. Do I take the B-1 bomber, or do I put more money available in our federal budget, for example, for housing?
Well, I would say, first of all, the work of the theologians is going to be indirect and not compelling. I mean, there is no way to solve those particular hard issues simply by looking back at the scriptural tradition or any of the world's religious traditions. It will not yield that kind of answer. What it does yield are people with a care and for those who are down and out, those who are on the margins, and a willingness to try to find credible, intelligible ways of overcoming the problem. So that is what it will do. Now, it can move beyond that, but I mean, first of all, it's limited. What we would hope to have are people in Congress who are shaped somehow by the religious traditions, at least some of them there, who will bring that wisdom to bear upon their own decision-making. And I admit it could go in various directions. But there's certain sorts of things that would be ruled out. I mean, the kind of thing that would just say, well, who cares about the homeless? We're not going to care about that. That ends up being ruled out. Who cares about the elderly? Ruled out. Can't have that kind of position. Now, let me say another thing that I think the tradition, I'm going back to Reinhold Niebuhr, a great Protestant theologian here. He took on Henry Ford when he was pastor of the Bethel Church up in Detroit and said Henry Ford wasn't treating his workers right. Took him on publicly and became one of probably the greatest public theologian we've ever had in the history of the United States. And then he began to teach at Union Theological. And what he learned from his confrontation with Henry Ford is you can't talk to people like that and say, hey, be nice to people. What he learned is that there's power blocks that work in the United States exactly as you were describing it, and that theologians have to start out by telling the believing public, that the church-going people, that power has to be used for the good. Don't just give power away or say it's of no consequence or I'm not going to get my hands dirty. No, he said you have to work through power. In fact, he came up with this idea of black power long before it was popular. He said if black people in the United States were going to ever make anything, they could never expect the dominant group to just give them something. They had to have power so they could get it. So what I'm saying is that I believe the theologians can instruct us in a proper use of power, where we use not coercively, but as a way of trying to make our opinions known and to try to move public policy in a direction that we think is more in accord with our religious tradition.
Now, I'm a practicing Catholic, and I've just heard your remark, and I'm thinking to myself, now how can I put what he is saying to work within my particular community, in my parish, in my family? And let me tell you, as a practicing Catholic, I'm sometimes frustrated when I hear, for example, those 10 or 15-minute sermons on Sunday, because they don't seem to connect. In other words, they don't seem to connect in very specific ways. They don't seem to address the question that there is a great moral wrong, for example, of depriving the poor while we heap billions and billions of dollars, often wastefully spent, for example, on the Pentagon. Well, how do we bring this question of the relationship between theology and cultural and public policy to bear within our parishes?
Well, I would say, first of all, we have to get to a point where those in charge of the preaching are willing to raise those questions. It's very easy for preachers to talk about personal life. Be nice to your family, say your prayers, and so on. No one yells at you as they walk out of church. But if you begin to talk about peace and war and the economy and feeding hungry people and housing the homeless like Jesus did, once you start talking about that, you get flack. So one of the things the theologians have to do is to strengthen the preachers and the leaders within the faith communities, the parishes, to be able to address those issues. They have to give them courage and tell them this is your proper duty, and you know it's hard, but you have to take the heat. It's part of your responsibility. Secondly, theologians have to give those people knowledge. They can't get up and just say, let's all be against homelessness. But they have to give them the biblical warrants, the reasons why we should be involved in the quest for social justice. You have to be able to justify that. For example, the theologians point us to Matthew 25, where Jesus says, well, I'm going to judge you now on whether you gave food to those who are hungry and drink to the thirsty and shelter to the homeless. That's what I will judge you on. So the theologians got to keep bringing that up before the preachers and the leaders in the parishes. Thirdly, theologians have to direct them to the importance of understanding the practical practical situation within their own parish and in the society as a whole. It's not good enough to just say, let's be against homelessness and find homes, but you have to also know what are the specific situations in your community. And if you don't know them, that's all right. I mean, you can't be an expert on all of this, but you have to be able to at least recognize that and say, now, you people have gotten the message. Now you find out how to do it in this community. How will we take care of the homeless here?
Okay.
And how would we function? So theologians can help by giving courage to these people and some enlightenment about the tradition and at least a recognition that you have to know the circumstances if you're going to be effective.
Okay, I'm on the parish council. I'm not, but I'm.
Yes.
Let's assume I am, and I recognize what you say, and I recognize the wisdom in what you say, and the practical value of your suggestions. But then I ask myself, but where do we get the resources? For example, where do we get the speakers and the knowledge that will give some strength of backbone to our pastors, so that they feel confident in their ability to take the flak, rise to the pulpit the following Sunday, and say, the reason that I spoke about the preferential option for the poor last Sunday was as follows. How do you give the strength of backbone to the parishioners who otherwise might be dependent, who go to church thinking, I want some smoothing words which merely reaffirm everything as they are? Because you see, most people in most Catholic churches, the most affluent religious body in the United States, most people, as you know, Father, in Catholic churches are fairly well off. Now, how do you reach those people? How do you inject the vitality of the scriptural of Matthew, for example, and the injunction to feed the poor and to take care of the homeless and so forth? How do you make people apply those kind of teachings within our Catholic tradition, for example, to their daily lives, to the point where they do something? Like speak to the pastor about the need for a greater awareness on these issues.
Again, I'm trying to slant it to what the theologians can do, and I think what the theologians remind us of here is the great importance of the community, that we don't really get things done or operate just as individuals. We really are in a communal situation, so that the theologians would say something like this, well, what we need is supportive groups that will work on this. In other words, if you think you're standing alone, there's a problem. So pastors often need support groups where they could be with other pastors, and in that support group they say, well, we're all going to try to preach every so often on social justice questions. Then they can come back to that group and they can say, well, we took flack and so did I, and the collections went down, but we're going to stick with it. There's strength in being able to share that with others. The other way that the theologians help us here in the communal dimension is to say, well, you need something like a social justice committee. You need people within the parish who are committed to this full-time, a peace group, a jail reform group, or many other task force groups that really commit themselves to working on this. And what you want to do then is get them to have sort of a prominent role. So we bless people, for example, at Mass who are Eucharistic ministers, and we say, that's very good, and we officially install you and so on. What we ought to do is spend equal time with those people who are involved with the social task, bless them, recognize them, give them encouragement, and so on. I know I was just talking to one of our students the other day, and he's involved in social justice. I just went out of my way to say, really appreciate you doing this. I know you're hitting your head against the wall. It's not a popular cause, but if you need any help, I'm with you, and so on. It's just a simple kind of thing, and if more people maybe did that, the lad would be able to keep up his courage and strength because he won't see a lot of results. We know that. So theologians, I think, are moving us to the direction of saying the value of the small groups, the base communities in Latin America that seem to work well, small groups of Christians read the Scriptures, how do we apply it to the local economic political scene, small groups in the United States that can do that. And the theologians go back to the Scriptures to say Jesus formed a small group, and Jesus worked through communities. And so they help us to see the value of doing it in that sort of communal way. Okay, now
what I hear you saying, if I understand you, is that by the use of all of this knowledge that you're talking about, which gives the strength of backbone to pastors and parishioners alike to address these issues, we can prepare people in their everyday activities to speak out for the values of our great Catholic tradition, so that by speaking out in our daily lives, in the law, by drawing upon this tradition in the law or in government or in business, we can have slowly but surely an effect on public policy. Is that what you're saying?
That's
okay.
Certainly one part of what we want to try to do. That's
now,
right.
Let's address, I know we don't have much time, but let's address the question of how we go about doing this within a particular tradition in a way so that we don't break faith with the implicit idea that in a pluralistic society no particular religious group can claim the right to dictate to others how they should think about these issues.
Well, I think that really is important. We have to respect that. And I think we have to, first of all, be happy with the fact that we live in a pluralistic society. We can't have secret hopes here that we're going to take over. And I mean, there are some in the religious traditions who think that way. I think the theologians can help disabuse us of that idea. And we really ought not to think of establishing Christendom here. What we ought to do is learn the rules of the game. The rules of the game are something like this. We are in a pluralistic society. We are citizens. We have a right to speak up, but we'll be heard to the degree that we marshal our arguments, that we get the evidence before people, that we can show the value, that we can present the wisdom in a coherent way. I think that we have to get good at it, in other words, so that what the Catholic bishops do is they have some of their best theologians go up to the hill, as they say, and to testify before Congress. Father Brian Hare has done that for the bishops for years, and they are very smart in picking a man who's that smooth and cogent in his argumentation and so on. So you have to get good at the game. You have to recognize the rules of how it's played in the United States and respect those rules fully and completely. But you see, I believe that what we need is a confidence that indeed we have a tradition here that really can sustain us. Tom, I'm talking away and I realize we have run out of time. I have to wind this up. I thank you for helping me to clarify this idea that I think theologians can help in forming better public policy. Sorry, I just looked up and it was we were done. I got another one to do. We have to eat.
We have to have lunch, yeah.
We have to have lunch.
Yeah, wait a minute now.
12:20.
Yeah.
Are you going to do it together?
What?
Another program?
Well,
Yeah, if we took a half hour, if we could
no,
take.
You have to get back. We got to eat lunch.
Okay.
You got to.
Yeah.
If
We'll
nothing
do
breaks,
another
you got to be
one.
back at 3 o'clock. How long does it take you to get back?
We need to find out.
Over an hour.
We need to. Yeah, it takes an hour.
12:30.
Yeah.
1:30. Yes, you have to go.
Come on, let's go have lunch. And, obscene.
It's there, 27 minutes, right? I do those television things 28:30, and I keep forgetting it's 27. Tell me what the first. We have to first of all be happy with the fact that we live in a pluralistic society. We can't have secret hopes here that we're.